Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and this was a bit of a strange week. A lot of what I wound up covering here left me fighting to be thoughtful and delve into all the weird corners for me to tease out my opinions. And here's the results of all that, so welcome back on the Pulse. So we've got 7 albums on the docket, so let's quickly knock this one out from Run the Jewels, RTJ4.
You go hold the egg, way to bring the check. When we talk, we Kalishnikov. Keep us in your thoughts, fully dressed at the crack of dawn. Weapons that
I already had plenty to say in my lengthy review of the album, most of which was a tangled dissection of why I think it's one of the best albums of this year, but didn't quite win me over to the same extent as their last 2 projects. But it's still fantastic, it bangs like you would not believe in its inflamed downward spiral, and it's worth running through all those flames in order to get there. So, light 9 out of 10, you all need to hear this as soon as possible. Next up from Hailey Whitters, The Dream.
With nowhere to go, getting drunk in the afternoon, red wine and blue.
So this dropped much earlier in the year, and I was sold it with the profession that'd be the sort of dream country for which I'd been an avid evangelist, and it's where I have to say this is not quite that. The second album from Hailey Whitters might be a little closer to pop country, an interesting diversion given some of her primary co-writers behind the scenes are Lori McKenna and Brandy Clark, and once I recalibrated my expectations off of that, and remembered that the first half of this album was included on an EP from last year, I found this to be pretty good, but not really great. Part of this is not really loving her vocal delivery. It's strident, it's a little piercing, a little oversung with a timbre that's kind of reminiscent of Lori McKenna and the more acoustic and subtle songs, but this album's also going for a broader, slightly poppier tone, and we don't really get the subtlety to flatter it. And while I'm on the subject of the production, I found the backing blend of more jagged electric guitars that might spark the dream country comparison to be pretty hit and miss, and the feeling that they were going a little overboard on the effects and flourishes in ways that didn't flatter the compositions nor the atmosphere. It's got the feel of stretching for uniqueness, and not helped by the fact that when I dig into the writing credits, it's pretty obvious when Brandy Clark or Lori McKenna or Brent Cobb are co-writing. And you know what? That still leads to some great songs. Janice at the Hotel Bar, Loose Strings, Living the Dream, Red Wine and Blue. But this is a dreamer's album that can feel kind of scattered in its searching for greater identity, which can have some pathos when she's questioning Nashville on 10-Year Town, but a little less so on All the Cool Girls, which might have felt less bitter if written from the first person. Plus we got another version of Happy People, and I was lukewarm on this song when Whitters and McKenna gave it to Little Big Town in the first place back in 2017, and this is probably the weakest version of it to date. But as it is, you know what, I've been on the record saying that country's been pretty great this year, and it's hard for me to explicitly put Hailey Whitters in that category with this. It's more hit and miss, and it's got the same problem as Carly Driftwood's album from last year, with mostly strong writing, kinda let down by some haphazard execution. So yeah, very light 7 out of 10. Again, the great cuts are doing a lot of heavy lifting. I just wished I liked it more. Next up from Sweet Whirl, How Much Works.
Loving you is just something I do.
Yes, I went Bandcamp diving again. How can you tell? So, Sweet Whirl, stage name for Esther Edquist, Australian singer-songwriter, previously a member of Superstar, with this as her solo debut album, who I'd argue plays to a very reserved but likable and well-performed slice of adult alternative, indie rock singer-songwriter material, less poppy and more rootsy than a Sarah Bareilles, but maybe not as esoteric or experimental as a Fiona Apple or Nico Case. And what immediately grabbed me about her was the voice. Impeccably placed in the mix, really rich, throaty, carrying the sort of quiet gravitas with enough wry charm that there's a real magnetism that draws me in, especially if she happens to be a good songwriter. And I happen to think she really is. What I like about her writing is a very specific emotional tension that comes through in fighting inertia, both within a relationship and after one, that comes with bucking against the paralysis of wanting to say more against those who would use or abuse you, but genuine affection or love or too many shared experiences kind of holds you back from expressing it, only enriched by a sense of weary maturity that gives these songs a lot of subtle texture. I mean, I wish there was a little bit more detail could have slipped through in the writing lighting to paint the scene, but what we do get is great. Unfortunately, the production is not that great. Edquist went on the record saying that she wanted to strip away a lot of the reverb that surrounded her previous recordings for something a little bit more spare and unique and intimate, which is great when it comes to her vocals. It really highlights them, but considerably less so when it comes to some really thin drum machines, some questionable Theravox integration that can sound a little chintzy, and some more slipshod mixing and mastering. I mean, reverb could have helped some of the blend, that's all I'm saying. It's also an album that if you're not engaged with her storytelling, a loose arc of the breakup, watching the guy in the picture cheat, and her steps to try and move on, it kind of runs out of momentum pretty fast, and it can get kind of sleepy and lacking momentum by the very end. But as a whole, it's certainly good. A little more polish could have made this great, but I see the potential for her to get there, so light 7 out of 10. Check this out. Next up, from Sounds from the Ground, Thru The Ages II. I think I would complain a little bit more about getting one of these out-of-the-nowhere veteran electronic acts that show up on my schedule if I wasn't convinced this is a covert operation to educate and expand my horizons, so alright, Sounds from the Ground. They're a UK duo who broke out in the 90s in the downtempo, psy-ambient, dub subgenres, and there's been some debate whether or not they were ahead of their curve in the construction of bubbly, bassy grooves opposite more textured percussion, integrating some small elements of techno, and slightly offbeat weirdness, although not quite weird enough to miss out on those good TV placements. Now, from my perspective, it's tough to evaluate impact decades removed from a group that otherwise didn't get a lot of attention outside of their niche, but while there's a robust sense of melody and some thicker groove to some great chill vibes that we get on their best, I'd struggle to call their material all that distinctive. Generally good, but not often great or super memorable. I will say in recent years their material has gotten a bit more glitchy and fractured while still maintaining some of that melodic foundation, and coming off of last year's Binary where that was really at the forefront, man, I really do wish this was more interesting. For one, a lot of their old dub texture has faded away, leaving a lot of spare, fractured ambiance that can carry some impressive atmosphere, and what percussion we get is very sharp, clipped, and metallic, or rounded beats that don't have the same dub-rolic, which would be fine if said grainy touches on the percussion were constantly feeling they were cribbed from Object's chittering playbook, or if the gurgling synth melodies coalesced more frequently. More frustrating are the points where they will pull back the ambiance for passages like the odd Tim Hecker-esque flute on Lemon Sky, or the grainy minimalism on Bag of Moon or Tomorrow's World Today, which if some of those points actually built to the main tune when coming back in, or brought a more potent crescendo, I'd probably be on board. But more often than not, they feel like disconnected diversions as much as any of the washed out guitar warps and horns do, and those horns sound really canned. Also, unlike the last Thru The Ages album, this project definitely can drag, which is less of an issue when these will play live, as I'm sure they'll be pretty good, but it also shows a number of places where they just don't end all that well, kind of jarring when the closer actually cuts off rather abruptly. But in the end, I wouldn't put this among Sounds from the Ground's best. You can definitely tell they've locked back into their comfort zone and downtempo, even with the added glitch that's hit and miss. But it's mostly well produced, it's atmospheric, it doesn't really slip up, so I can't be that annoyed with it. So 6 out of 10, if you're into this sort of thing, check it out. Next up from End, Splinters from an Ever-Changing Face. Hey, do you like metalcore that's less about tune or structure and more just about demented, crushing aggro punches to the face that reinvents no wheels or ventures outside the overdone formula but will absolutely satisfy the target demo's primal urges? Well, here's End with their debut album, picking up some obvious Full of Hell influences and then dropping a pile of suffocating breakdowns with little in the way of groove or hooks but are purpose-built for the pit. And compared to a lot of the metalcore and post-hardcore I praised in the past couple months, this sort of material does not grip me whatsoever, but I guess I can appreciate the sheer chaotic intensity, and there's a few breakdowns I liked, especially when the mix gets a little bit more cavernous and crushing. And one thing for which I will give this album some credit is a lot of the songwriting. Not only for how viscerally detailed the poetry is, but in juxtaposing how someone might be consumed with self-destructive nihilism and rampaging despair and rage with the knowledge that they will be damned and liars might take their place in paradise, all around the framing of samples that begs the question how much of this is self-delusion versus an untrustworthy system, particularly coaxed through a lot of religion. And hell, that's potent stuff. And the more this album embraces some of that gothic framing, the more I get the appeal, but that's before it starts actively running together without much in the way of hooks or tune or a stable groove, even in some of the content. In other words, look, I know this isn't my thing. I don't want to call it bad because on some level it's doing exactly what its audience is looking to get, but outside of the content, I'm not sure if this is going to wind up being even memorable within the scene. And without great production or grooves or hooks to really put it over the top, it doesn't stick for me. Strong 5 out of 10. But if you want something in an adjacent mold that does work, from Backxwash, God has nothing to do with this, leave him out of it. I'm kinda kicking myself that I didn't get to this immediately when I first heard Backxwash on Bandcamp a couple weeks back. Yes, I heard this album before Anthony Fantano's review, and it's only my insane schedule that prevented me from getting to her sooner. So, Backxwash's brand of experimental and horrorcore hip-hop, she is described as being driven off of productive rage, which, going back to her short but pretty punishing debut Deviancy in 2019, you can hear the groundwork in her crushing pileup of bars, her visceral delivery, and a lot of the warped production. And expanding off of that into this, yeah, pretty great. Part of my appreciation of this comes in taking the blown-out, bass-heavy, and trap-inflected bangers and giving them a haunted, visceral edge and a real sense of deeper humanity. She's confronting a church and societal structure that would cast her aside. Someone's balancing out self-hate and depression. She's embracing the black magic that's stigmatized both for its heady, addictive elixir, but also as a cry for protest. And not only does that feel rooted in an expansive but unstable sense of real danger, there's a core of longing to be better and to be accepted. She's the black trans sheep of her family, but she still cares about them, which adds a lot of subtle dimensionality, especially in the project's back half. But then there's still the gut-wrenching horror that comes with the song like Into the Void, and she can make that just as workable. And while I always have some trepidation surrounding the horrorcore as a genre label, I talked about this in my clipping review last year, it not just fits the aesthetic, but in the themes here as well, where Backxwash goes through the sample choices like on Black Sheep, how traditionally black or pagan culture was being branded as demonic by such a church. And this becomes as much about reclaiming cultural identity as it is self-identity. Oh, and also it's got a core melody, great hooks, and it would bang like you would not believe. I'll say it again. Now, I do think there are places where she can go from here. It's still very short. I'd love to see some of these songs developed with some thicker atmosphere and poetry that could be a bit more robust, but it's absolutely the right step, and Backxwash has made herself a force to be reckoned with. 8 out of 10, y'all need to hear this. And finally, from Armand Hammer, Shrines.
Rare earths. Every rabbi wonder will his golem work. Every golem wonder if they was the first.
I'll be honest, this was not the tone I was expecting from Armand Hammer, especially coming off the apocalyptic Rome and the thorny labyrinth of Paraffin, because the last thing I thought is that this group would actually be getting lighter. Well, that might be a bit of a mischaracterization, but in comparison with how damn apocalyptic and dystopian their last two projects were, and once you decoded them, pretty explicit and all that, Shrines feels like a bit of a detour into more imagery and abstract symbolism than the hard-bitten lessons and harrowing stories that I found so compelling coming from, say, Billy Woods' Hiding Place, or indeed those last two Armand Hammer albums. Now, I'll always argue there's been a sly sense of dark humor to underscore a lot of their work, but here it feels a bit more obvious in its non-sequiturs, not just because of the slightly brighter production, but also that sense of real exasperation in some of the audience getting half the message of change and aspiring for more, but just not following through. So instead you get a bunch of small, scrappy half victories that wind up getting you through the day, but at what cost? Especially when they wind up feeling undeserved, which is what you get in confronting systemic racism and broader societal inequality. Because instead of making that big societal changing fix, you get a lot of drifting half measures that don't fuel the deeper soul. And while you can find some small tokens to moments of success, shrines, if you will, what will they have really driven beyond continuing a potential cycle of violence, or not really breaking you out of it? But I like how the album ends on a tentative note of optimism, first showing a requirement for a subtle internal growth and some self-actualization, but then follow with where and how to enact some real change that will get there beyond the moment, while staying wary of those who might betray the cause from within, which is the big reason I don't find this album nearly as apocalyptic or forbidding as the last two Armand Hammer albums. But by the same standard, it's also more diffuse, and without that gripping intensity, it's a little easier to lose track or get lost in the narrative, partially because where Billy Woods is slowly exposing more humanity, Elusive seems to be still dwelling in a lot of abstraction outside of his excellent final verse on Ramses 2, but also especially when the guest stars don't really show up to the same degree, which I did feel was the case for Quelle Chris, Rap Ferreira, and Earl Sweatshirt. Not the case for Fielded though, she sounded amazing. And on a similar note, I wouldn't quite say that's as melodically gripping. I mean, the production's still textured and fractured and sample-rich, but I like to think some of the brighter moments would come with a bit of a stronger tune or a groove, or dare I say even a hook. But it can feel a little bit distracting with how much the fidelity shifts from song to song, from some of the cleanest tones the duo has ever touched in years, to the unstable, choppy murk that's been their standby. And I'll admit I probably found more to like in the latter category, if only because it matches some of the wordplay a bit better, from the fractured melody off the dusty but heavy percussion of Pommel Horse and Slewfoot, to the snarled growl off the guitar off the clanking percussion and cloud of cymbals on Leopards, to the slight keyboard flutters on Ramses 2, to the stuttered guitar playing off the flattened warps on Flava Flav, or the even more spare electronics on Dead Cars. Although I will say the brighter horns off the bass on War Stories, it really worked for me. But overall, look, I think it's still a great album, but I don't think it's as strong as Rome or Paraffin, although I will fully admit that's more on me looking for a little bit more direct focus and not always clicking with some of the more abstract diversions. And like with every Backwoods studio project, I will fully expect to have my opinion oscillate a half-dozen times before the end of the year. This could well wind up among my favorites. But for now, light 8 out of 10, great rap music, I'm happy I got it. We'll just see where they go from there. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Bit of a odd week, I will fully admit that. A lot of stuff you probably won't hear, which means a lot of you won't watch the review, typical. But beyond that, hey, if you guys actually want to have any comments about that, link down there below. And I know, tough times, probably not the right time to ask, but if you guys want to get involved in my Patreon, help influence my schedule, links right over there. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.